behind the scenes, it was a small group of people that were doing everything.
Welcome back to the GTM podcast. It's your host, Scott Barker.
I want to know how this insane growth actually happened.
Hello and welcome back to the GTM podcast. Hope you're having a great day wherever you're tuning in from. This is Sophie Buonasisi filling in for Scott Barker, in case you're wondering why Scott sounds a little bit different today. We appreciate you lending us your eardrums for the next 45 minutes. We always try to speak through stories to help you level up. And if your learning style is eyes over eardrums, we also have a newsletter that drops every Friday packed with actionable insight. But without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce a fantastic guest, Daniel Weiner. Daniel, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Excited to connect and dive right in, which we can do right now. So a little bit of a background and bio. Daniel is a former agency executive turned founder. He started YouShouldTalkTo in 2020 amidst the madness of the pandemic, and 3 years later has turned it into a 7-figure business. He also hosts a podcast and private CMO dinner in Atlanta. Outside work, he enjoys all things food and cooking, playing basketball, working on renovating his loft. Daniel, anything I missed there?
I was going to say, you nailed it. Sounds just like me.
Perfect. And I feel like we could go off on a separate tangent about renovations.
You're looking at my my renovated loft as we speak. It's a gift and a curse, a passion project during COVID, and now I'm sick of renovating and want something new. So,
well, it looks fabulous. I feel like that was COVID. Everyone suddenly was turning internally to their living spaces and getting creative and finding ways to keep changing and keep things exciting and fresh. Well, let's jump in because super excited about this conversation. It's really relevant right now, especially with fractional work increasing, just overall economy shifting, headcount at companies, to really thinking about how do companies think about engaging an agency, Daniel, or overall freelancers? What would you say would be some kind of tactical advice that you found to be really fruitful when you're speaking with companies?
yeah, I think it all starts with a strong foundation of defining exactly what you're looking for, what you hope to spend, what you hope to accomplish from it, the time frame in which you hope to do that work, whether it's a project with a clear start and end point, or more of an ongoing evergreen type thing that would manifest itself into a retainer. And I think the biggest thing since COVID, especially, but I saw kind of a shift before, is uh, being open minded to different setups. Like people are still, I think, becoming used to the idea of like a fractional support system in some regard, or an army of freelancers versus an agency or internal hires. So I think, yeah, a big generalized tactic would be keeping an open mind to figuring out the solution that works best for you and your company versus just listening to what everybody else says, even myself.
How would you say how to gauge what is best for you personally? Because sometimes there is a lot of noise, and we all know recommendations are huge. So we see everyone asking in Slack groups, hey, have you worked with anyone specifically? So it's a lot easier to get swayed by how their other people are employing partners and external partners. What would you say is the best way for actually assessing internally what is the best fit for someone, whether it's agency, freelancer, any other type of partner?
Yeah, I think it's important to talk like with the Slack communities. I see it there. I see it on LinkedIn. And I think that's actually unintentionally one of the worst ways to do it, only because I see most people just not ask any questions. Somebody will post, hey, like, has anybody worked with a, demand gen agency? And like 20 people will reel off agencies without asking a single question. What are you hoping to spend? What's your tech stack? A million other questions that I would ask during some sort of discovery phase. But I think the best way, it's truthfully the lowest barrier of entry is 2 lists. The first list is what you were looking to do. The second list is what you were hoping to spend, in my opinion. And then it's a lot of conversation. There's not really like a perfect science, truthfully, which is why like there are platforms and some version of AI that do what I do. And I think it's impossible. I think the biggest mistake a lot of brands make is they rush through the process. They think we talk to 3 or 4 agencies, we'll just hire one when none of them feel really right. So to get back to like the actual tactic, I joke like it could still be the worst decision you ever make. It could go completely south, but on the front end of hiring an agency or a freelancer, you should be really excited. You should have a feeling of promise of what's to come and saving time and growth and all that good stuff.
Now, that's really interesting because I feel like there's a common narrative and common trend of everyone asking in communities who everyone uses. And like you said, oftentimes there isn't a lot of context. I've been guilty of that myself plenty of times. And thankfully it has worked out. But I'm curious why that's, one of the actual worst techniques, as you stated.
Just because of the lack of context, I would say it's not necessarily a bad starting point. I just see people waste significant amounts of time and energy, right? If with certain requests and certain services, I can look at a list of agencies and say, I know they are going to be astronomically more expensive, and you're going to waste 30 minutes of your time talking to them, not because they're bad at what they do or they're bad people, but every agency has different cost structures and minimums and things of that nature. But yeah, I think it's more uh I've seen, at least in the last 3 years of doing this, like, somebody will say, hey, we're in the B2B context, which is, largely GTM fund, we're a series B company, we're doing X amount of revenue, we spend this on marketing, who should we work with? I have found it just to be less indicative of future success, just because that company saw success with a certain agency. It is so personality driven and working style driven, the stuff that's like really hard to put actual tangible metrics around, right? Like I talk a lot about non-tangible and tangible things. Tangible meaning like if you look at an agency website, you can get like a feel for who they are, but the non-tangible things is how well like teams collaborate and work together and mesh into the day-to-day. Which is why like when people just reel off a list of agencies, it just lacks that context. Also, the other downside, which luckily I don't see many of my agencies on those lists, people will say, hey, I had a terrible experience with X agency, like avoid at all cost. And people will say, oh, I'll avoid them as well, and they don't ask questions. I would argue close to 100% of negative agency client scenarios are somewhere in the middle in terms of fault of agency and brand. So I think when you lack context, it's just really difficult to necessarily just find success starting it that way.
That makes sense. That makes sense. And the context, I mean, is everything. When you lose that, you lose a lot. I can see it more serving as a shortlisting function where, you get a certain amount, there's some form of trust, but you still actually have to do the homework. So it certainly does not replace the need to actually do the homework, understand how that fits into your unique context.
Everybody's going to recommend their friends, I guess I should say. The agencies I work with, while I would like to consider many of them friends, it's an objective view, right? I'm giving the good, the bad, the ugly, what I think about my agencies, the answer of what my agencies are best at. If you ask them versus me, they're probably going to be 2 different questions. I give you my honest opinion of what I think they're good at and what I think they don't do so well, which they may answer differently. So it's just hard, I think, to get objectivity in that sense.
And I want to circle back on utilization of and vetting of agencies and freelancers, but want to kind of double click into that around. Tell us a little bit more, especially for the listeners. I'm fortunate that I'm privy to understanding how you should talk to functions, but how does you should talk to function? Because I know when we first connected about it, I was actually amazed by the structure because I was unaware from the outside, and understanding how it actually functions really opened my eyes up to just having a trusted partner in that process.
Yeah. So first step is typically either inbound or referral or me, getting in touch with somebody who has some sort of need, typically a CMO, a VP of marketing, a director of marketing, anywhere from startup to Fortune 10. Small companies, medium companies, big companies. it doesn't necessarily matter at the very beginning, at least. Everything starts with conversation. So in an ideal world, a brand would have a brief or requirements or something for me to review prior, which doesn't happen often. I would say that's not the norm. Usually brands are utilizing me to chat through the need at first. And then it's just I would say, akin to a discovery call that anybody in sales would take. I have the unique perspective of working on the agency side. So a lot of it is just breaking it down into simple concepts of what you're looking for. So I always use like the website one because it's easy. Somebody will say, "Hey, Danny, we need a new website." I say, "Great. What do you want to build it on? Are we talking design and development? Who's doing content, all that sort of stuff." If they don't have a document, I'm oftentimes sending them a live Google Doc for them to fill out that helps arrive at what I would consider like a poor man's brief. We talk through budget. At least the joke I make is, what's the number that makes you not want to throw up if they do not have like an actual budget in mind? I'm often giving them historical data of, hey, a similarly sized website that I helped recently, they spent X. Does that sound in line with expectations? The budget conversation is a big portion of what I do because I work with agencies of not all shapes and sizes, but many shapes and sizes. And budget matters. Some just do not work on certain types of projects or certain sizes. Once that is all figured out, I'm generally making introductions to 3 agencies on the agency side. So once I get off that call, in the context of it being super well defined, "Hey, Danny, we want a WordPress site and we have $100,000 to spend." I'm generally looking through my list and picking out 3 agencies that I think are an excellent fit. I call them always to talk through it, to brief them, confirm no conflicts, answer any questions they may have on the onset. At this stage, since I like to think I'm pretty good at what I do and I know my partners super well, generally I know that they're interested in the opportunity. Once we confirm that on the phone, I'm framing up the intro to all 3 agencies. Every agency of mine will reply same day, which is super important to me and my partners, then set time to chat at the leisure of the brand. Once I make the actual intro, I'm out of the sales process. Agency will take over, and I turn into an objective third-party soundboard for the brand, as much or as little as they would like. I just won't tell them who to pick. So some brands utilize me a lot. There's a case study on my site that I've posted about a ton on LinkedIn. Yamaha was an exciting one, a reputable brand. They wanted to chat after every single round of conversations with agencies to give feedback, to talk through what they were thinking, perspective, all that sort of stuff. Other brands, not so much. They don't. Once I make the intros and they've got some agencies, I've done my part, and they don't necessarily take me up on the advising piece. And the concepts are similar on the freelance side in terms of making intros to freelancers, calling to brief them. It's usually just less and more targeted. So I work with about 200 agencies or so and about 150 or so freelancers and consultants. The freelancer side is more targeted, I would say. Folks are oftentimes through me looking for what I would consider production. We need a writer, we need a designer, we need a developer, stuff like that.
And again, want to circle back on agency versus freelance, but there was something actually that I learned about You Should Talk To in the past that I'd love to just dive into a little bit more. And it's actually around your cost structure, because prior to understanding more in detail about You Should Talk To, I had assumed as a brand to be able to have such an advisor or trusted objective advisor, it would come at a cost. But you have a quite unique cost structure. If you wouldn't mind just elaborating a little bit on that.
Yeah, always free to the brand as of today. Who knows if that will eventually change. But yeah, as of the recording of this podcast, free to the brand for everything. So that could include everything I just talked about. For bigger stuff, I'm oftentimes writing a first draft of RFPs or reviewing their RFPs and giving insight. All of the money comes from agencies and freelancers. So some agencies pay me a retainer plus a small commission, other agencies no retainer, larger commission. All the freelancers are commission based as well. I also encourage everybody that I work with, agency and freelancer, not to raise their rates to account for my involvement, as to be able to pass on as much value to the brand as possible. There are other folks that do what I do. I would say that is a more traditional, like, quote unquote, search consultant who, charges the brands a ton of money to do that process. But I flipped it a little. And I've seen great success with that. Easier proposition for me to tell a brand that I'm free as well.
Definitely. I mean, once I learned that, I was thinking, what a no-brainer to be able to work with an
people think I'm
expert.
full of shit a little bit sometimes. That they're like, "How are you free?" And when I tell them, it makes sense. But on the front end, I get that often. So
Yeah, it almost brings me back to your renovating the loft hobby because I'm in the middle of moving right now, and a big part of it, I'm assessing paint colors and any kind of renovations or furniture. And I realized that all these companies have these free consultations, and I've signed up for a bunch of free consultations with these experts, and I'm elated about it because to be able to get that objective feedback and advice is incredible at no cost. And I kind of draw that parallel between when you are a brand and you're looking for an agency or freelancer or any kind of partner to be able to have some kind of objective party to guide you and provide context. Again, it doesn't necessarily replace your network, sharing insight and information on what they're using, but it adds that layer of context and objectivity overall.
yeah, I also don't force intros, which is something I've heard about competitors of mine. Like, there are many calls I take where I'm either not comfortable with where the brand is at, like in terms of them not being ready for conversations with agency. Like, they haven't figured anything out and they should go back and have some internal conversation. Or they'll say, "Hey, we're talking to 8 agencies next week." And I'll usually in those scenarios go, "Great, talk to those 8. And then if you're unhappy, come back to me." Like, I don't want to set my agencies on a wild goose chase if you're, talking to 10 agencies. Or if I feel like there's an incumbent, somebody that they're going to hire regardless, and my agencies are being set up for failure as to just be like thrown into the mix. Like, there are plenty of conversations where I'm just giving, I don't know if it's advisory or advice or context or what, but just having conversations with brands and helping them figure their stuff out where it doesn't necessarily even lead to an opportunity for my partners.
Absolutely. And one thing you mentioned was a big kind of fault that happens for brands is rushing the process. Now, what are the implications when there are perhaps rushed or not as optimal hires being made for brands?
I'd say the two biggest mistakes is rushing the process and not prioritizing the process. The stakes are just high. The earlier stage you are, actually, not even that. It's just high stakes for anybody. You hire a bad agency, regardless of if you're spending $1 a month or $1 million a month. Like, it just sucks. It's an important decision, and it should be given the time that it deserves. Right? It doesn't have to be a crazy long process as well, but it should be given, I would say, the right amount of time. And there is no like set amount of time that every agency process should take. However, if you're talking to the kind of the shtick of You Should Talk To is finding an agency is easy, finding the right agency is hard. If you start with a list of the right agencies, which is generally what I'm doing, the feedback I get after the first round from most companies is, they were all totally relevant, like in our budget, and potentially fits for what we do. The process can be shorter, right? But like, prioritization needs to be given in order for it to not be a crazy long process as well. But it should feel natural is what I tell people. Like, when I'm working on, I would say more in line with like an RFP where there's like an actual timing of events, like agencies receive RFP and first round conversations and pitch. Oftentimes brands will try to stick to that when, it doesn't feel right. They need to have another conversation with an agency, for example, and they'll say it's not on the schedule, right? As long as there is open communication between both parties, the process should take as long as the process should take, right? And if you prioritize it, which is the biggest mistake I see brands not do when they don't prioritize the process, if you do prioritize, though, it's going to take the right amount of time, and I don't think it will feel rushed or like that it took too long. It'll feel how it should.
That makes sense. Should feel easy, should feel right.
There's just no set process. There are like pillars and different like high level things from a process standpoint, but in between that, for each brand and each agency, different things need to occur, right? Some brands want to talk to agencies more. Some want to talk less. Some want to do a more traditional RFP process where there's like an actual submission to a portal before a pitch happens. It really just depends. Like my aim, and what I preach on LinkedIn all the time for agencies, is know your audience and figuring out what makes them tick. And that's what your process should align to.
You bet. Exactly. And that's why I think we're seeing a lot more agencies and firms specializing, because you can be in line with your audience a lot more. You can walk the same walk. You can understand their objectives at a much more intimate time.
Yeah, I'm the biggest proponent for smaller specialized agencies taking over the world at the moment. It's what I see every single day.
I love it. And what about with the rise of fractional work? So we're seeing, of course, with the market, a ton more great, super talented folks going fractional. What are those implications for brands when they think about working with either agencies or fractional folks, freelancers? How do they then assess the arena and decide who is a best fit for me, given that there's so much more fractional talent available?
Yeah, I think similar to the agency side, the first thing is defining. And before even defining the ask, I think both sides, and like one of the, I don't know if it's necessarily like an industry wide problem, but the word fractional and freelancer and strategist and all these words, in my opinion, have become muddied. And everybody has like a different definition of these things and different budgets associated and different like time expectations for what people are going to do. I think that's the biggest thing that needs to happen first. Like if somebody's going to, semantics matter and words matter in a lot of these things. Sometimes they do not, but in this world, I think they do. I often get asked for like a fractional CMO. And I go, cool, like talk me through what you mean by that and what you want to spend. And it's always $5,000 a month, which in my opinion is not a fractional CMO, or not akin to like the budgets and money that a true fractional CMO would warrant. So I think the first thing is defining what these things actually mean, but it's the same logic, I think, on the agency side, right? What do we want? What is the time expectation we expect? And then I think the difference and the nuance on that side is what is the relationship you want, right? With an agency, you get a team. I think you, to a degree, you know what you're getting yourself into. But I think the biggest thing that I think brands and fractional people need to be like super honest is expectations of time and relationship style, right? Do you have the expectation that I'm like working a set amount of time during the day, or I'm available at certain, times of the week? How you figure out that stuff to me is the biggest nuance on the fractional and freelance side. And also if it is what I would consider like strategy and big idea type stuff that doesn't necessarily yield like a tangible deliverable versus delivering a tangible thing, right? So if you're a designer, I can design something and I can hand it to you and you can look at it and feel it and touch it and stuff like that. If you're like doing really high level fractional strategy stuff, it's yielding itself in ideas and probably emails and maybe documents, but the fruit of that work may not come for a year, right? How does that relationship transcend, from like putting thoughts into action and then actually seeing results of that work, which could take an incredibly long amount of time?
That's super interesting because it sounds like fractional can be leveraged really well for strategic work, in addition to perhaps output, but agency more so on the output, the regularity of it. Not to say that they are entirely separate by any means. There's a ton of crossover, but understanding that work output, and there's so much more depth around understanding what you actually need. Oftentimes, I think we get so entrenched in the end result of what we want. We don't think about the communication, like you said, or the cadence, things like that. And what I've kind of seen across, especially living in my past life in the conversion optimization space, is that consultative process is just gaining such momentum. People don't necessarily want an end result or just the end deliverable. They're really looking for consultation and guidance throughout that process to understand their options, to understand the overarching actual industry and what's trending and how to actually navigate it themselves. So I think we'll see the rise of consultative going into more agency in addition to the fractional side.
Yeah, I see that, and then I see the other side, like two, I think, interesting. I don't know if it's trends yet or not, but like in my world on the agency side, strategy is often like a dirty word because brands all want it 100%, but they don't want to pay for it when they see it as like a separate line item. So if your engagement is $40,000 and then you have another $10,000 line item for strategy versus just saying the whole thing is 50,000 bucks. I often see brands have a hard time wrapping their head around the 40 plus 10 versus just the 50. Same numbers, right? But like a different framing of it. And then on the brand side as well, I see oftentimes, at least for me, I don't know if it's indicative of like the actual market, people use the word fractional executive because they just want to spend less, right? They think it equates to like, oh, we'll save some money. And oftentimes, like, in my opinion, true fractional executives are not necessarily going to save you money. It's just a different engagement, right? You might not be ready to define what a full time employee looks like or something like that. But like the true fractional CMO stuff I've seen is like really expensive. It is not necessarily a cost saving, but I think brands oftentimes see it as that. Like, oh, we'll just get like a fractional, just get a fractional CMO. Like, if they're fractional, like we'll pay them less and they'll do just as much. So I think it's a lot of like the best consultants I work with are masters at defining expectations, right? And they're really stringent on what they take on if they don't think it aligns to the sort of lifestyle that they have grown accustomed to.
That makes sense. That makes sense. And want to transition to a little bit of a story and take you back in time. We always try to speak through stories here at GTM Fund, and I want to bring you back to 2020, an interesting year, of course, when the pandemic hit. But you went through an interesting transition in 2020 because you were actually employed at a company. And that's when, as you mentioned previously, You Should Talk To actually came to fruition in that year. So I want to rewind you and give you the floor to tell us a little bit about how that transition happened and take us through that story.
Yeah, I was working for a husband wife team at an agency for 7 years leading up to COVID. COVID decimated our agency, I would say. I resigned May of 2020 and truthfully had no clue what I was going to do next. I was interviewing with agencies, I was interviewing with brands, and to be honest, like nobody had their shit together or could like tell me what they wanted. Rightly so. Like the world was, in utter chaos. But yeah, I was like doing handshake deals with agencies, right? Like people were still reaching out as the world like slowly, or we realized this was our new normal, as they say. So people would call and say, hey, like I need X, Y, and Z. And I was like, oh, I don't work at an agency, but like I think I know somebody who could do this. And I would call that person or agency and do like a handshake deal over the phone. I'd be like, pay me like a percentage if this closes. And they'd be like, okay. There was an agency I was interviewing towards, I think it was like July or August, that I was not necessarily excited about the actual agency. I was excited about the team I was going to get to work with. The person I was interviewing with called me and said, this is super unorthodox, but I'm leaving the company. I said, okay. And that was like the final straw, I think, of like, I needed to take a break from interviewing and just didn't want to do that. I was laying in bed, I believe it was September 8th, and the name You Should Talk To popped in my head. And I said, if not now, then when? I bought the URL and the rest was kind of history. The weirdest thing, I guess, during that year, which is why like COVID was, I would say, the best thing that ever happened to me personally and professionally, despite the ridiculous and depressing parts of it. People are like, oh, it's so commendable and crazy. You started a company in 2020. It seemed like way less of a risk at the time, truthfully. Like everybody I talked to is in such an utter state of disarray. They're going to like work for somebody else and bet on them or like take a smaller piece of the pie seemed, I don't know, kind of ridiculous. And I saw like a path, truthfully, like relatively early on, where I was like, I think I'm pretty confident I can make this work. Like, at least to like replace my rev or my income at my old job. And that happened by like month 3. So I feel very fortunate that like I never had like a super, super scary month of like, oh my God, like there's no money or like this isn't going to work and stuff like that. So it took off relatively quick. And I joke that I didn't really have a choice to like not keep going because it grew organically. So yeah, it is simultaneously the most exciting thing I have ever worked on in my entire life and the most stressful. So
Usually how it goes, starting a company.
I would agree, but I own the stress, which many people talk about. So if you're going to be stressed, why not own it?
I love that. I love that. And I'd say it's a common thing that we've heard across the pandemic in 2020 and just that time where it's almost a forcing function of experimenting and trying these things that perhaps you've always wanted to in a way, or you're capable of, or have an idea around, and previously maybe it was tucked under as we keep going throughout these processes. But once we're in this strange different time, it really gives people the opportunity to explore those things. I love that the name just came to you in the night too.
It did, yeah. It's funny. At the very beginning, I had several people be like, "Oh, it's too long and it's too like kitschy." I was like, all right. Well, like we'll see. I can always like change the name or something like that." And that's been the most common like positive feedback I receive. Is like, "Oh, I love the name. Makes total sense. I get exactly what you do." I'm like, "Oh, okay, sweet." So yeah, it's I'm not a I think one of the more like I don't know if it's dangerous, but like weirder narratives I see online in the like entrepreneur space that I take the opposite opinion of is like, if I can do it, so can you. And like I don't even know if I can do it some days, truthfully. You've got to be like, I mean this in a positive way because I would describe myself as this. Like you got to be a little bit of a maniac to like start your own thing and like do this every day. There are a million pros and there's a lot of cons as well, but yeah, it is hard, but it is the most rewarding thing I have ever worked on. And yeah, I'm now one of those weirdos who like can't sleep at night because I'm so excited about what I got going on the next day. So I wouldn't change it for the world, but I don't know that it's for everybody, if I'm being honest.
It's definitely not for everybody, but it's beautiful if it is for you. We always joke we call it the sickness here at GTM Fund. If
It is
you've
it is
got
a
the sickness,
sickness.
Daniel.
I 100% have the sickness.
Yeah, yeah. And coming out of this experience, I mean, now you can look at it in retrospect. What were some of the biggest learnings going through that process? Because that's such a shift of lifestyle, of career, of trajectory overall. What were kind of some of your greatest learnings along the journey?
Um, it's like so many different cliches, truthfully. I've like totally become that person. But like relationships are truly everything. Like I can, you know, I don't know if you watch Homeland, the show on HBO where Carrie draws like strings with points on a bulletin board to like connect the dots. Like I can connect the dots to like, I don't know, 5 or 6 people that have changed the trajectory of my life and my career. And it's all from unintentionally building this, I would say. My network has grown. You should talk to what it is. I've obviously played a part in that, but yeah, like finding a few of the right people and groups like GTM Fun and stuff like that. The biggest thing that I guess I've learned is all the stuff that doesn't scale is what is the most successful in my own business. I tried doing outbound at the very beginning and was like shocked that that didn't work. That like random people on the internet didn't want to hear sales messages from me.
Shocking.
I know, crazy, right? The stuff I post on LinkedIn once a day, every morning. So that is the stuff that works. Hosting dinners works, and just generally meeting as many people that make sense as humanly possible. But yeah, like network is your net worth. I don't know if there is somebody who believes that more than myself. So I try to do the best job at curating. I would say the community that I have built that is an informal community, but Yeah, that has been the biggest learnings. And every time I try to like change something or add to it, I'm constantly reminded that like that's not what benefits me or my business. And I don't necessarily have to add new stuff. I just need to double down on the stuff that does work.
Oh, I love that. Network is your net worth. Say similar mindset here at GTM Fund, and doubling down on the stuff that is unscalable is really, I mean, impactful, but also what we're hearing a lot of people saying right now, especially as greater efficiency is needed. It's harder to scale and go wide and tackle all these different things. And rather than having your hand in a bunch of different pots and doing the job mediocre, it's really how can I do a certain finite amount of jobs really well or channels really well on that working. And one of those, I mean, you mentioned a lot of your growth comes from organic. Maybe that's community groups, maybe that's social. You are fairly active on LinkedIn. You put out a ton of great content. Do you have any tips for brands, for founders, any go-to-market executives on how to consistently put out good quality LinkedIn content?
Yeah, I feel like I have like a an alternative opinion on this one as well. I see a lot of people say like, "Oh, you shouldn't post if you're not providing value. You must provide value." Um, which I think is overall not great advice because I think it then makes people scared to not post. I took the opinion very early on that I was going to choose consistency over literally anything. And I've become mildly religious with it that I guess my statement that's counter to the value stuff is who determines what's valuable. And I don't know that I can come up with something like obscenely valuable every single day, right? But it's for me as well. It's become a ritual. It helps get my brain going in the morning while I drink coffee and stuff like that. So there's the selfish side of it there. But I just want repetition. I saw early on people would say, "Oh, I saw you on LinkedIn," or like, "I saw your post." I go, "Which one?" They go, "I don't know." I go, "Okay, well, that's still good. You saw my name." And when that happened enough times, I just took the opinion that as long as I'm not posting like drivel, I always want to post something insightful. But when I guess the biggest shift in all of that stuff was like just doing it and not thinking about it. I tried at the very beginning. I wanted to go viral, like I'm sure everybody does, and I would post something that I thought was the most brilliant thing I'd ever come up with. And I would get like 3 likes, and like 200 views. And I'd be like, oh my God, what's going on? And then I would post something that I thought was like silly that nobody cared about. And it would have the opposite effect. When I started just posting and walking away from my computer is when I think mentally it became more beneficial to me because it just became another thing that I do and I hope for the best versus trying like to create these Pulitzer Prize award winning posts every single day because I think that's impossible. I just try to be authentic and funny, truthfully. I want people to say when they meet me, like, oh, you sound exactly like you do on LinkedIn. That's to me one of the greatest compliments I can receive.
Yeah, it's almost flipping it and doing it for your own benefit to a degree where it's part of your morning routine. It's part of just your overall habit and so forth. And so it's benefiting you plus the other kind of added benefit, of course, of adding value to everyone, but then the effect that it creates. I love the example where somebody didn't actually remember which post, but they're familiar with your name and that you add value on social. So that's a huge part of it. It's lesser about the exact formula of a singular post. It's more of the compounding effect of what posting online actually does over time.
Yeah, I mean, even at like the GTM fund retreat, when I met people for the first time that I've been connected to on the internet, I got several, oh, you're the You Should Talk To guy. Like, I am. That is me. So to me, like, that's a win. And yeah, it's as much for me as others. I just think if you go in with this notion of like, I have to create these like amazing, insightful things, you'll never start, truthfully. Like, I never post something that I don't believe in or that's not factual. Like, I never make up stories to fit a narrative or stuff. But yeah, I think the consistency thing, I just see so many people give up. They post for like 3 or 6 months and like, nothing crazy happened. Been doing it for over 3 years now. And there's so many things that happen that aren't, I would say, trackable. There are plenty of people who have turned into business for me who have never once liked a LinkedIn post or commented on a LinkedIn post, who have referenced though when they've reached out to me, which is exciting. hey, I've seen you on LinkedIn. I'm like, the real me wants to say, well, throw me a like every now and then if you're seeing it so often. But yeah, like I saw somebody post about it recently, like the success is in the trenches or in the shadows, not the trenches. There's so many people who see your things and see what you're doing, which is why I'm so bullish on consistency over literally every other metric.
No, it's so true. I mean, we can see the amount of impressions that a post or posts will get, and then the amount of engagements. And naturally, impressions is far higher. There's people absorbing, there's people that you are getting that brand impression from that aren't necessarily engaging. Now, I want to switch over to a founder question, something related to what we talked about previously. So, really circling back here. And it's how do you properly vet a list of agencies? I've been referred to some by trusted sources, but when working with them, found that they weren't a fit.
Yeah, I'd say it all starts. I hate using the word, but the vibe. I talked about this the other day in a LinkedIn post. So I'd say the first thing is how they make you feel, truthfully, like not to make like, a correlation to dating, but how when you're speaking to an agency, how they make you feel. They should empower you. You should feel smarter. You should just feel like you can visualize yourself working with that agency. And I genuinely believe that can happen in the first 5 or 10 minutes of a call, right? Like, if you enjoy speaking to somebody and how they make you feel. And then you get into like, it depends the extent at which you want to go. So I talked about it this morning, actually. There's so much stuff that agencies provide that without the right context just feel like bullshit to brands, right? So if you're a brand, you may say, well, this agency won an award. I'd say take it a step further and look how the award was given, right? Was this something they like purchased? Was this like a reputable thing? Case studies are very similar, right? If possible, I would want to ask if you could speak to the marketing leader at those case studies, right? For all you know, that case study was from 10 years ago and they haven't worked with that brand since. Things like references all make sense as well. I often recommend brands ask only one question to references because of course, an agency is not going to provide you a reference to somebody who hates them or says terrible things about them. But I hope you get an honest answer. If you ask, you ask the brand reference, you say, if you were going to hire for this service at a new job, would you just give it to this agency or would you open it up to an RFP? And see what they say and how they say it. You get if they're like, no, I would just give it to them, that's to me a pretty compelling answer. And if they waver at all or waffle a little of, yeah, I'd probably want to talk to some other agencies, that's a data point to dive in and say, why? I'm curious. Like, did they not give you enough trust and all that sort of stuff? So I learned very early on when I tried to make it a scientific process, it's hard. I don't think it's possible to turn it into a scientific process, but you pick the data points that are important to you. If reporting and seeing results are important, I think it's taking I guess the short answer to all of this is not taking anything at face value and continuing to dive further until you feel supremely confident. So you can arrive at what I said earlier of when you sign an agency contract, 6 months from now could be the worst business decision you ever made in your life. But on the front end, you should feel supremely confident. And if you're not, you should either have more conversations and talk to different agencies, or you should ask more questions to the agencies that you're chatting with.
Great advice. And I'm going to squeeze in a second one simply because it's very related and it's founder question here. I am assessing a bunch of agencies or have assessed a bunch of agencies and find the process super time consuming. What can I do to make that process of properly vetting an agency or a freelancer less time consuming?
I would have some questions about that before giving an answer, but it depends what you consider a long process. I can say this, like I helped with a big, in my world, it ended up being close to $100,000 a month for an agency. Start to finish with an RFP from first conversation to penning of the deal was like 5.5 weeks, right? That felt that is the best case study I'll ever have of it feeling natural, like super robust as well, and getting to the finish line quickly and efficiently. The biggest thing there was prioritization. The two people who were involved in that made it their life for those 5 weeks. They prioritized not only things that were on the calendar or the schedule of events in the RFP, they prioritized follow-ups with agencies who had questions, who wanted to dive into data, who wanted to give them, a tissue session of like talking through ideas, engaging their feedback. That's what made that quick. But again, not to plug myself, like if you are buttoned up as a brand, right, in the website context, and you come to me and say, hey, Danny, we've got $100,000 to build a WordPress website. I could put you on the phone with agencies tomorrow and you could hire them by the end of the week in that context. But it only happens if your problem or what you're looking to solve is well defined. So I would say the speed of the process begins and lies with the brand, truthfully, of well defining what they're looking for, well defining their budget so that there's no time wasted. So that if your budget's $100,000, you're not talking to 3 agencies who only work on $500,000 websites and things of that nature.
Makes sense. Coming back to the brand, defining what they're actually looking for, their budget, to have that seamless, quick process. Now, if they don't have that, it's not, hey, you can't run this process. It just realistically aligning with expectations might take a little bit longer.
Yeah, if everything is well defined on the front end, it's like the garbage in, garbage out saying. If it's well defined on the front end, agencies are going to come in supremely more prepared. And it's going to feel like a shorter process regardless, because they're not going to have to go back and rework a million things versus them saying, oh, we had an entirely different interpretation based on what you sent us. Like you have to have those conversations. That doesn't necessarily guarantee you a wildly quick process, but it's all relative. I have enough data at this point that like for what I would consider like robust RFPs, like a month to 4 to 6 weeks to me is like a reasonable amount of time to like, if you're going to have 5 or 6 agencies, start the process and you get to the end where like 3 are pitching, which is generally what I recommend. Like, yeah, 4 to 6 weeks, I think you can do it if you prioritize. For smaller stuff or project-based things where there's a clear start and finish, if you're buttoned up and prioritized, you can have an agency contract in 2 weeks, depending on what you're asking for in a proposal, and if you want a formal pitch, and if the agency needs to go back and put a ton of custom thought in, right? Like a website is something they've presumably built many times, and the process and structure of that proposal is something they could put in front of you probably on a call, right? Versus like a robust ABM program or a demand gen program probably requires a decent amount of discovery or even a paid discovery phase where they want to dive into things. So the prioritization, the next level of that is just access, like giving agencies what they want to put forth the best plan possible allows the whole thing to be more efficient.
2 final questions, Daniel, before we wrap up, and take these wherever you want them, or take these wherever you want. We always keep them intentionally vague. First, what is one widely held belief that revenue leaders have today that you think is bullshit or no longer serving us?
I would say just the general world of attribution and being obsessed with attribution. I get that in 2023, soon to be 2024, there are a million tools that can hypothetically track and measure everything. And I'm a firm believer that you should measure stuff. What's the saying? What matters gets measured. But I think people become overly obsessed with it, and it takes the creativity around it. Especially in the context of GTM fund and B2B brands, I think where B2B companies lose their way is when they stop being human and it feels like B2B, and they could take a page out of B2C by attempting to be a little more creative. And I think if you're so hyper focused, which probably starts at the top in the C-suite of measuring literally everything or you can't do it, you lose out on some of the good stuff and you're not able to test and measure. So on my podcast that I host recently, somebody, Jamie Horowitz, who was on the B2C side, had said something that resonated well, which was you earn the right to have some fun. So we talked about being obsessed with measurement and all that sort of stuff. And her point was, yeah, I'm in a new role and I'm probably not going to go crazy at the beginning. But once I have proven that I can keep the ship afloat and, on the right path, like, yeah, I'm going to have some fun. And I'm going to tell my leadership that we should be testing and doing these sort of non-traditional things that hopefully work out.
I love it. Really earning the right to experiment there. Well, second question, what's one tactic or strategy that's working for you or the companies that you're serving?
For me, it is private dinners. I know no greater tactic than putting a bunch of CMOs and VPs of marketing in a room, buying them dinner and selling them nothing. I have seen no greater marketing tactic for myself. I think the reason that, not that I'm not opposed to sharing stuff that I see working, I don't even like worry about other people doing that because it's the biggest perk of working for myself, right? Where I can play the long game, be super intentional about like relationships. Other brands just like cannot help themselves. I've been to enough like sponsored dinners where like the sponsor sells something for 20 minutes, right? And you're sitting there going, huh? I've just seen that not be as fruitful in the long run. Whereas I try to give people a fun evening of dinner and drinks and put them in a room of their peers, free from sponsors or agencies or vendors. And yeah, those have been very fruitful for me. And I'm doubling down on those in 24.
I love it. Doubling down in 2024. I'd say we share a very common perspective on those dinners. I think when you can get people in a room and actually create that value where they're able to connect with their peers or with the brand themselves and just have mind share in a very authentic, safe place, you can expedite your learning incredibly well, plus build incredible relationships, of course.
You guys do your dinners well. I actually sat next to a sponsor of one of your dinners in New York, and they didn't sell anything to anybody, which was great in my opinion.
Now, good. I'm happy to hear that. Well, it's the first year that we've done sponsors, and what we did, we're quite careful in terms of if it was appropriate to bring sponsors on. It's all symbiotic, part of the flywheel of why we have sponsors now, so we can support our founders. But we went after last year's GTM retreat to all of our community members and said, hey, how would you feel about bringing on sponsors? Small curated amount, very intentional, not for the masses, not to sell at all, but just overall to support all of our business objectives. And everyone, I think it was 98% said, oh yeah, absolutely. We love learning about new technology. If it's a small curated, trusted group, great. So I think it is that fine balance of how do you find a place where nobody wants to be sold? Everyone wants to learn. So if you are educating, if you are helping and adding value at those dinners or wherever you are online, great. But nobody wants to be sold to, especially not at a dinner when you're in this kind of intimate, safe place.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Great. Well, where are your dinners, Daniel? How can we get an invite?
They're in Atlanta right now. I'm doing the first one in another city, Q1 of 2024 in New York. So it'll be for CMOs, VPs of marketing. And yeah, hopefully it makes me incredibly nervous to do it outside of Atlanta since I lose control. But we'll see how it goes. If I do your podcast again, I'll report back on that.
Perfect. We'll run it back afterwards.
Yeah.
And where is the best place for people to find you, Daniel? LinkedIn, Twitter?
I'm on Twitter. I'm not as active as I probably should be. But yeah, LinkedIn or Daniel at YouShouldTalkTo.com is always a safe bet. But yeah, I'm a perpetually online on LinkedIn. So you can find me there for sure.
Brilliant. We'll link to it in the show notes. And what is the name of your podcast for anyone curious to check it out?
You Should Talk To. I felt like the company name named itself, So yes, You Should Talk To is the podcast on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts.
That is wonderful. We'll also link to that in the show notes. Anyone can check it out. But Daniel, it's been fabulous chatting with you. Thank you for sharing your insight across how to assess and work with agencies, freelancers, so that way brands can understand how to properly leverage external expertise, and your story, of course, throughout the pandemic.
Thank you for having me.